nanohub.org.
Online simulation and more for nanotechnology.
So it's my honor to introduce Professor Ashu Sabharwal from Purdue University. So I knew Ashu from 2007, 2008, I think, when I was a student at Rice. So I was working on my own kernel stuff, and I know Ashu as an information theorist. I say, okay, these guys don't build this. It turns out Ashu, I was totally wrong. Ashu lead a project, it's called WAP. Basically, that's the de facto experimental platform, whole software hardware stack for wireless research. So that is a very successful, used by hundreds of research groups worldwide, and generate 500 research articles. Then after I left, Ashu grew into this healthcare research, which he won multiple center scale NSF grants. So Ashu's research has led to 4 commercial spin-offs, and 1 in wireless and 3 in healthcare. So without further ado, let's welcome Ashu.
Thank you. All right, thanks for the invite. I think the workshop is already successful from my point of view. Since yesterday, I've only learned new things. So I think that doesn't happen in many of our conferences. We go there, we generally kind of know most of the stuff, and we're happy if we learn one new thing. And every talk I've heard, I'm just delighted to be able to learn new things. So today, actually, I'm going to talk about something quite different. I'm going to talk about methodology and tools we need for research. And then I will touch upon 2 areas. I'll touch on wireless networks, which is where I've spent a lot of time. And that's why I think of myself like that. I feel old in that area. But then around 10 years ago, I got into healthcare. Rice is right across the world's biggest medical center. And then over those 10 years, which is not that long in research careers, we're beginning to understand where we can actually make a dent. And I think we're just discovering same sort of issues beyond the research. So I feel like that when I think of research when I started my career. So I will spend more time here today because that's where things are more mature and we understand a lot about things. And I will spend last 15 minutes or so on that, on the left side. Okay, so today I'm actually going to talk about a platform/testbed. And then I want to actually start this discussion, and for the wireless agenda, I will try to answer 3 questions. First question will be on the research methodology. And I will kind of want to convince everybody why do we need a new approach, or why do we need to reconsider our approaches, especially when it comes to experimental research. Then I'll go to the how question. How can we actually deliver that new approach? And then what can we do with it? Okay, so I'm going to try to walk this journey. But I wanted to start with something which is has been on our mind for the whole scientific communities, which is what I would call just the 3 R's of scientific research, which is all of us who run experiments in any form, doesn't matter which area we work in, have to be very aware of. And they are repeatability, replicability, and reproducibility. So repeatability is something which is very crucial when you actually are doing the research, where the same team can do the same experiment with the same hardware or whatever the setup is, and then be able to repeat results. It's something you need to do to feel confident that you have a result which you can now submit for publication. Replicability, in a sense, becomes important in the review process. So you essentially want to remove the team, give everybody the same piece of thing, and can they generate the same result? That means there is no secret sauce in the experimenter. It's the setup captures everything. And then if you actually take the different team with a different set of setup and then same experiment generate similar results, either statistically or exact results, then that is when it becomes science. It becomes a concept. We understand that if you mix 2 chemicals, it generates a third one. We really don't have to be dependent on what shape of the beaker or the test tubes it is. Then we understand it has become a part of our science. Now, over from wireless is one of those areas which is very lucky. It actually has extremely strong theory. Okay. So as a result, for wireless researchers, we actually get to use all 3 components. So all 3 things are at our disposal. We have very useful theoretical tools and very useful simulation tools, and then of course experimental stuff. And this has actually been a mix which has been going on for a long time. In fact, if you look at the history of wireless, the experiments came long before, where Marconi and demonstrated wireless communication in 1890s, and in 1909 he got a Nobel Prize with Carl Braun, who had shown similar experiments. And that's where the wireless was born. And then around 50 years later, a mathematical theory of communications which started information theory and a few other areas around it, a seminal paper by Claude Shannon came about. Now, as I said, we have all these three methods: theory, simulations, and experiments. The thing is that the 3 R's are really easy in my opinion, for theory. Really? I mean, in the sense that you have to disclose the proof, otherwise you can't get published, right? And then all steps are reproducible in a proof if you've written the proof correctly and written it completely. And in this case, hardware is anyway immaterial. It's just a different piece of pen and paper, essentially, right? So theory is, fortunately meets all these 3 R's I talked about. Now, and simulations, I think, because of the code, the way things have now moved, simulations have reached that status that you can actually reproduce simulations easily, right? You can download software. We have similar hardware, so we can run it. It's the experiments, especially when we have custom hardware, that things all break down. And all 3 R's are actually pretty much a challenge, in my opinion. And actually, access to hardware itself is a challenge. You really don't have access to some, most people actually don't have research labs where they can actually have experimental platforms. So, and unfortunately, repeatability, the truth is not part of the research DNA. In fact, in many papers I read, I am pretty sure that they cannot repeat that experiment in their own lab, okay, with the same set of experimenters. It was generated a day before the deadline, is very clear, okay. So, then I think other R's are not even worth discussing, but replicability is not possible, we don't verify by review processes. We don't have actually methods of doing it. How do we review something like that? And then reproducibility is just not valued in many of the communities. That why would you want to redo somebody's experiment? It's just big no-no in actually how we do things. Now, should we care? It seems to be wireless is doing really well. By the way, it's $1 trillion industry. Should we really care? And I think we should. And there is clearly, just for the sanctity of this whole process of, coming up with new results, we have a correctness challenge. We really cannot check many of the results. And some of them actually claim quite fantastic things, which they can make work in the lab. So I think, and then they get cited, and then, they can actually propagate for a decade before somebody says, actually, it doesn't work the way it was written. So I think it's a problem for the whole profession itself. But I think the bigger problem is we have an amplification loss. Okay, what do I mean by that? In theory is very good, because if I actually read a theorem, I understand it, immediately I'm ready to extend it forward. I can build on it. In experimental work, you just simply cannot. Most of us have no access to that hardware or that particular special experiment. So either I will reproduce it somehow, which just takes me a lot of effort, or I just don't do it. Right? So actually, in fact, that's why part of the reason we actually cannot build on experiments the same way we build in theory. And that actually we are losing out, in my opinion. As a result, the whole field moves really slowly. And we already know that software, if we are all doing software on general purpose computer, that field has moved much faster, largely because you can build on top of each other. Right? An example being Linux, and these days example is machine learning, which is moving at a breakneck speed because we actually share things, and we can build on top of each other. So really what we are really going after, what we hope is, how can we do things with custom hardware? Really if we want to do this right, we have to think of what I will call open experiments. And I think as I was listening throughout the day, there was a talk about running experiments, things like that. And I hope people here actually also recognize that actually is an important contribution to make to actually do the research enterprise correctly and move it forward faster. So what are the 3 parts? We should have to actually aspire to have open code and open hardware. Okay, so that means we have to somehow publish the code that can generate the actual experiment. We have to actually publish the data we got from our own experiment, and how did we process the data set. And then we should also process we talk about how do we take that process data set and come up with the analysis, right? And we actually do not really do almost any of the steps. Some of the journals are now requiring this last step. Nature, for example, does it right now. But actually there was some paper written which says only 20% of the papers, even in Nature with the policy, are still just, only that part is reproducible. Even that is not done very well yet now. Okay. So what can we do about it? So I wanted to actually shift into the tools for experiments, and in this, I wanted to chart our own history, especially in an area where theory dominates. Theory is the king. What was the role, and how does experimental platforms actually played a role? So, and in this case, I'm actually going to be a little bit RISE-centric, in the sense that a lot of this started at RISE, and there was, I think, mostly there are only 2 groups actually in the country which actually looked at it, have worked on it for a long time. Okay, so for us, things have charted. When I was fairly young, as I said, I used to have black hair at one point. I got into also, for me, fortunately I was trained in Bell Labs. They did not distinguish between theory and experiments. They just seamlessly moved whatever was the right tool for finding the answer. And I think that was very good training for me as a graduate student. So, after trying to build experimental, showing things by experiment, eventually we ended up building our own platform. We just couldn't find anything in the market. So we built something called Warp. I won't go into detail of what it does. It's a custom hardware we built. The first 2 generations were built at RISE. We actually distributed to around 80 different research groups before my PhD student decided to actually start a company called Mango Wireless, and that company is still operational, sells this new generations of this hardware. But we actually built different design flows which really actually allowed different research communities to take this piece of hardware and then use it out of the box. And I think that was our biggest contribution, which in retrospect we can say is our biggest contribution. But it allowed people to build these test beds which they just couldn't do before. So it lowered the bar for people to build custom test beds in their own organizations. So we ended up learning a lot through this process. We held in the beginning 11 different workshops. First we taught people on hand. Then we figured out that we can actually teach them online. And then a lot of that content we actually translated it online. Became the way where most of the graduate students will start using this piece of hardware, and then that led to a lot of basically a standard adoption. Now, in most of the conferences, you have to use one of the 2 available platforms, Warp being one of them. Otherwise, you actually cannot get paper accepted anymore. So, in a sense, for us, it changed these communities which were largely simulation-based to now doing experiment-based. Okay. Now, we had a huge impact locally also. Like RISE benefited a lot. Yeah. Our whole culture in our research groups changed. We actually built an education program where we actually had real wireless in our labs. It was not a simulation. It was just not a MATLAB simulation. Our students can actually see things working over the air. Tons of collaboration happened. But I think the thing we actually built it for, we got a lot out of it. So even though it took me many years of publishing nothing on it, eventually we got a lot out of it. And then the 2 things which really are now going to be part of next generation systems or are being discussed is full duplex wireless and something called massive MIMO. And I'm going to talk about massive MIMO. So this is Felix's advisor, Lynn, actually started this project in 2011 when Warp was already fairly established. And out of the Warp boards, he built a massive MIMO array. So this is the new concept, which is all these base stations you have currently only have 4 or 8 antennas at most. Soon they will have 60 to 100 antennas. Okay. And that introduces a lot of interesting opportunities and challenges. But there was no experimental evaluation of this concept. It was a theory paper in 2010. So around 2011, we put together our first system out of 17 different Warp boards. That went up to 64 antennas. A few years later, we assembled an even bigger system, which went more than 100 antennas. Then we built things which were mobile powered. And now we actually have, with on RISE campus, 4 base stations which are deployed, which is a fully software programmable wireless network. Okay, so it's actually, right now we are the only one we have it, actually, for that matter. And so that actually is a capability we have access to, and in fact we were surprised. One of our friends actually sent us this ranking. So I thought I'll put it up. Which is for us is surprising because it's actually most influential scientific research institution in telecommunication industry. And so it looks over a decade and we are actually only a group of 5 faculty who work on it, and compared to all other universities. And I think largely because we are under one roof, we do almost everything in this whole span of computer engineering around, and then experiments. We are theoreticians. I also publish in information theory, protocol designers, and so on and so forth. So we clearly benefited a lot from going outside the normal research operation and building experimental research as part of our culture there. Now going back to where I started the discussion, as I said, theory is easy. What did WARP achieve for us? It actually did only one thing out of those different things. It made access possible, but still not that widespread. Even though I can talk about 125 research groups, it's only 125 research groups. So if you think about it, still many universities cannot actually afford to actually build this system. And the replicability and reproducibility still remains unaddressed. Okay. So, what are we excited by moving this discussion forward? Really, we're excited by this whole idea of shared testbeds, which is an NSF initiative, and then especially the program called Platforms for Advanced Wireless Research. And I'll say one slide on that program itself. So this program, we are one of the teams which has started last year. It's called Powder Renew. It's actually 3 teams made it to the final, and then 2 of us merged to make a mega team. That's why there are 2 acronyms in this name, Powder Renew. Okay. What's the origin? NSF, I think all of us probably have seen the top 10 big ideas, and one of them is mid-scale research infrastructure. And during Obama administration, there was a $400 million initiative on advanced wireless research to essentially bring back, make US leader again in wireless. Actually, that leadership is things which were invented in US. US was always a leader in wireless, essentially moved out of US. And as part of that initiative was the Platform for Advanced Wireless Research, which is a $100 million initiative. $50 million is cash from NSF, and another 50 is a consortium of companies, around 30 companies now, which provide in-kind equipment. So this program will fund 4 platforms. In the first year, it funded 2. The Powder Renew is one of them, and then Cosmos, which is Rutgers, NYU, and Columbia is the second team which is going to work on. Okay. So I'll give a few slides of what this effort would be especially for the Powder Renew. Really, we want to be in the business of not just us doing what I would call the world's first. Our thought process was, how do we enable everybody to essentially have the same access we had for all these years? Okay. So we're essentially building a network which is essentially Amazon of wireless. Actually, you can think of that way. You can remotely use this infrastructure. You will have access to the hardware like all of us would have who are, locally had. Okay. So what does it include? So, the massive MIMO system actually spun off another company from Rice called Skylark, which actually produces this 3rd generation, which is a base station which has these hundreds of antennas. And it's the first base station commercially made which is fully programmable. You get bare metal access to the whole system. Okay. That means you can actually program it to do anything, any standard. In fact, there is a deployment shown. This is Rice Stadium, and then the other base station you see, I've labeled one of them is AT&T base station, and our base station is actually deployed right next to it. Okay, so it's really like a practical deployment at around 90 feet up, just like any other commercial base station you will have. It has tons of other features which you need in any commercial system. Is based on a custom developed software defined radio. which is probably one of the smallest SDRs right now. And that allows Skylark to put together these large number of antennas in a very small form factor, which you can then deploy. Now, where will they get deployed? They will actually get deployed on the University of Utah campus and surrounding area. So this is the deployment match. In University of Utah, there will be a deployment on campus, in the residential area, and all the way to the urban area. So it will be a pretty large deployment, which will include these base stations. In addition, it will also include multiple other software-defined radios. For example, National Instruments make many software-defined radios, which is the other, as I talked about, there was other effort which was bought out, a company which was bought out by NI. So all those software-defined radios will also be deployed. So you will actually have access to pretty much everything in the market in this system. And the other benefit is that it will cover pretty much all the interesting frequencies in the sub 6 gigahertz band, which is where most of the commercial networks operate today. And then this program is working quite closely with FCC. That means if you want to run an experiment, you don't have to go to talk to FCC to get a license. Basically the testbed itself has a license so that you can run experiments. So the idea is that we lowered the bar so low that you actually can just log in and run an experiment on a fully deployed network. And in fact, this deployed network will have mobile units. That means there are nodes which are mounted on shuttle buses and other mobile units, allowing you to actually mimic a small city communication network, which I think many people will find it interesting here. Now they can actually make or break this thing as they want. And I think that's where it's really crucial, I think, from this workshop point of view. So, Renew, which is the RISE team, along with Michigan, also has a pretty ambitious agenda we are finishing off 1 year. One base station is actually already in Utah getting, actually mounted as we talk. And then it will be available for everybody. Actually, it's available today. You can get a technology preview. If you go to powderedwireless.net, you can actually log in and in fact get a sense of what this whole experimental setup will look like. But as we release more code, you will actually be able to now stay perhaps even ahead of the game from the 5G deployment. We will be actually trying to stay ahead of the industry this time, which is typically not possible in academia. Academia is like few years behind the industry. Okay, so what's the message here? So as I said, replicable and reproducible experiments are hard today. This was the state of the affairs. But soon, in fact, I would say around March 31st, when our official deployment should be done, might be plus minus a few weeks, it should be straightforward. That means now a custom experiment should be as easy as tearing a paper. You will actually can send a link to your experiment to somebody which has all the code you used to actually do the experiment, all the data you generated from the experiment, and all the analysis you did in the experiment. Okay, so I think it opens up potentially new things for us to do. So really, we can get to the open code very easily. That's by design. The experimental hardware is shared. Replicability would be now straightforward. You can actually get the same nodes which I might have used for my experiment to get statistical replicability. And reproducibility, where I think we make the first leap towards it by providing you different hardware with same capabilities so that you can actually move experiments from one place to another. So we think that's the first level of reproducibility there. Alright, so often when I talk about it, it's so general. I say you can do anything with it. It's just such a broad white slate. Then okay, what should I do with it? Okay, so I wanted to give at least one example today, and which I want to talk about what type of things you can answer, and you can only answer through experiments. Okay, so that's, as I said, wireless is very lucky. It has a very strong theory. Information theory does very good, but now it cannot answer everything. Okay, so I wanted to give an example of where experiment becomes the only way to move forward, and I wanted to base it on this paper. This is written by this is written actually just recently in 2016, which talks about this new technology which will be part of the 5G system, but there is one, what is considered an open challenge, is unsolved. Really, even nobody really has an answer of how to solve it. And for wireless folks, they will immediately appreciate it, that it's how do you operate this network which has hundreds of antennas in what is called a frequency division duplex mode, which is how all your cell phones operate today in US. And that's a very simple idea. You actually transmit in one frequency and receive in another frequency. It's called frequency division duplex. You take your spectrum, divide it into two chunks, and all your downlink traffic goes in one band, your uplink traffic goes in another band. Turns out that mode of operation, and that's how actually FCC allocates spectrum in actually most of the world, other than I think China, which has TDD spectrum. And so wireless operators already own spectrum. They have a very important incentive to actually use the spectrum. Unfortunately, massive MIMO is just not a good technology for that type of operation. And largely because it has huge number of unknowns because of the number of channels. As a result, the overhead to actually operate a massive MIMO system completely overwhelms any gain you get in actually using these hundreds of antennas. So there was a solution hypothesis which had been actually been suggested in the literature, which talks about, hey, maybe the dimension of this wireless channel is not that high. In another space, it could be lower, and that hypothesis is based on essentially propagation, that actual propagation happens as a system sends data and then sends energy, and it only bounces off a few scatterers. Okay, so the problem is that actually none of the current models which are used actually account for this thing. And then the key hypothesis was that something we can learn from one frequency we could use in another frequency. Is that possible to do? Okay, so this is perfectly an opportunity for an experimental setup. So this is actually done using our previous generation of base stations, and we can actually now we built a system which allows us to do channel measurements across two very different bands as fast as possible, and then we actually measured tons of channels. And I'm going to just quickly say 2 slides about this work, which essentially shows that what you learn from one frequency is actually useful in another frequency. So that was one of the findings, especially when you talk about the angle of arrivals. Okay, and that is a very low dimensional space. So you can take large dimensional space, but actual dimension in another transformation is very low dimensional, and it is so low dimensional you can actually operate it like current networks. That means the overhead you will have for a 64 antenna system is essentially same as a 4 antenna system today. And that essentially is a protocol we just published, which allows us to actually demonstrate that you can actually operate these massive MIMO system in an FDD mode. Okay. Now this may not be the final protocol which gets used, but I wanted to give an example that this is how the experimental stuff, experimental platforms can be very useful when you're trying to answer such questions. Okay, so I have tons of other examples which are similar, which actually show other functionalities which you actually really cannot, nobody will believe if you wrote a theory paper. I won't believe myself. I would actually have to demonstrate through an experiment. Okay. Alright, so I will wrap up the wireless side of things. And really our mission here is, in this case, we are building something for the community. So our mission is to move where we stand today, which is personal software-defined radio, to completely shared software-defined networks, radio networks, right? So so that the whole community gets the benefit of these advanced infrastructure. So we have a fantastic team. In this case, we also have members from University of Michigan and our local university, Texas Southern University, and actually the team is about to grow. We are hiring some more folks. And so I actually wanted to stop here because I'm going to switch gears and talk about something else and see if people have questions at this stage.
I know you have done some work on full duplex.
Right.
Is that in that aspect?
Yeah, it will be supported to some extent. Yeah. Anything else? Any other question? One to just make me happy? No?
You get control over so you said there will be antennas in buses, it simulates a city, right?
No, it's a real city. It's University of Utah campus and around.
So, okay. So when you do an experiment, you decide where to deploy your program?
You can request for specific nodes. And then essentially there is a scheduler. And right now the scheduler will likely give you most of the network. It's very simple scheduler right now. It's time sharing. But eventually the scheduler will do more sophisticated thing. It will give you a time, spatial, and frequency slice.
But then you probably get affected by other people's experiments.
Well, the slicing has to be done so that you're not affected. So that's, I think, the key reason why we are not doing more sophisticated slicing yet, because we don't have a radio map up and ready yet.
Okay.
But yeah. So, but I think it will do as much isolation as it can. And then we will provide people tools so that they know what they are affected by. So basically a software tools which will allow you to see how much interference you already have before you start your experiment, middle of the experiment, and so on and so forth. In fact, we are actually building that framework so that you are aware of what you are affected by during your experiment, as much as possible, from measuring from your point of view.
So here at Purdue, we are competing in something called the DARPA Spectrum Challenge.
Right.
And but that's simulation. So that's simulated in Johns Hopkins. So that
yeah, it should run here eventually. Because it's a basically you can do, because you can architect the whole thing. You can create interferences, you can, create all sorts of scenarios. So we are hoping that some of these challenges can then move to, whether DARPA one will move or not, but some of these we can actually do this here. And then community can actually just kind of operate in that same environment and improve things. And then in addition to the radio, I actually went through the slide very quickly, but in addition to the radio, we will actually have the whole stack. That means it will have a network stack, it will have an open EPC, the network core, and then run apps on it, so on and so forth. So you will actually get the full stack, a stack which you can start working with.
are there GPU servers?
Yeah. And and the board actually these also there are FPGAs on it too. So it's a beast of a computing system which is getting put together, yeah. And the way it is getting put together, it will grow with demand. So it will have something today, and each year as people come in and ask for more, so the resources are not all charted out so that we don't know exactly what the usage will look like. So each year we will learn and ask the community what more they want, and both on the software and the hardware side, and then take our whatever resources, because we have a limited funding, take our resources and put it there. And so it's really being developed as a product for the community, and I think that's the key thing to. So the more the community interacts with it, in the beginning there will be a little bit of a pain because we are still figuring things out. But the more people interact with it, use it, the more we learn from it, the higher the benefit is overall.
I think some of the scenarios that they have, that the DARPA has also a high factor, like there are drones.
Yeah, so the Utah is very interested in all that. So actually we have a drone platform we are building at RISE, which is actually technically not part of it, but that interest is coming from many places. So I think there is a good chance that we may just grow into that, even though that was not part of the. So Edward Knightley is really built a pretty nice drone platform now for research, and if things line up and there's a lot of interest, that may go there. Now it's a little bit of a different thing to operate because drones are batteries and safety and other stuff, but I'm pretty sure that there is a way to work around it in some limited capacity, right? In some space first, and before we talk about people just flying it anywhere in the city. Yeah. All right. So I will. If there are no more questions, then I'm happy. I will be around, of course, today and tomorrow. So I'm just going to quickly switch over to the completely different topic. Actually, got nothing to do with wireless. So really, I just run two separate research groups, and some of my students are surprised when they meet each other in social settings. You're working for Ashu, and you're working for Ashu, because they work in two separate groups and in two separate buildings. So, and in this case, actually, I took the description is slightly skewed because of this workshop, but I wanted to talk about, here is Houston's challenge, which is many people in the South will relate to. It floods every year. It's like clockwork, nowadays. So this is the one which was in national news just recently, right? Couple of years ago. And this is Harvey, which dumped around 30 to 60 inches of rain in 5 days. It was consisted of 23 tornadoes. It caused catastrophic flooding in almost all of the 22 watersheds in Greater Houston. And then 10 out of our 19 bayous actually reached record levels. So you would see many pictures like these. This is how the city looks like on a regular day. This is it looked like at the peak of the flooding. You can't see some of the roads and most of the highways were submerged. So I'm actually going to talk totally on the human side of things, not the infrastructure side of things. So this was actually, Florida is another place which actually gets hurricanes. So this was a study done in Florida where researchers actually had tracked some residents before and after the hurricane season. Okay, and what they found out was that really for people who paid a lot of attention to the media, they actually were suffering with higher probability with what look like post-traumatic stress symptoms. Okay, it's not a full disorder, but it has all the stress symptoms of essentially they have as if they've gone through the trauma, even though they were not flooded, for example, right? So the act of watching news was just sufficiently traumatized in some sense. Now, in fact, for folks who are unfortunate and do get hit by hurricanes, APA, which is American Psychological Association, actually dedicates quite a bit of their website to how do you manage stress after such a traumatic event, right? Which is, for most of us, we are not prepared for this. There's nothing which prepares us for such, you losing your house, for example, right? So, really, we are actually, because we are affected by it, we are asking these questions these days quite heavily, working closely with our folks in psychology and Baylor psychiatry, that how do we measure human resilience? Okay, so in healthcare, we do understand when things go bad, but human resilience can be thought of essentially like a fitness. We really don't have a mechanism of understanding human resilience. Okay, and that could be in a personal level, in a group level, in a larger city scale. How do we feel about these, and we don't know actually the taxonomy for that, to be frank. And there is some evidence that psychological, resilience or stress otherwise actually does impact health, but we really don't understand its causal pathway. So neuroimmunology is an area which has been understanding this quite a bit, but we really don't understand all the pathways. We're also not very good in measuring them today. And then there is an additional, if you could measure it, you can ask, can I enhance it? Just like fitness. And then the question is, how do you test and validate something like that? You can't subject people to trauma to test whether they are now more resilient or not, right? So, so there is a fundamental problem in actually testing such concepts. So, in fact, each of these bullet items is a huge research area by itself, depending on how you cast the problem. And then a lot of these questions and some more such questions are essentially what constitute what we started at RISE around 10 years ago, which is the Scalable Health Lab. Now we are 3 core faculty in this area. And we ask often questions like these. How do you measure loneliness and its impact on health? Okay, and then these are asked from an engineer's point of view. When we say measure, we want a sensor, we want a variable, we want something which is automated. How do we measure depressive anxiety states? How do we understand how social structure impact our choices? And then, of course, as I said, how does resilience measure adverse events? And then the fundamental challenge in all these human studies, which is easy to do in wireless, is essentially the key challenge here is how do you understand causality, the causal pathways between behavior and biology, which is really a massive area by itself. So how do we go about doing it? Essentially for us, we essentially all our projects, I would say, fall in one of the 3 buckets. We have what we call the clear clinical problem. So this is not just, this picture is bigger than just a pure resilience starting point. So we have things which have clear clinical needs, but still problems persist. So asthma was where we started from. That spun off a company. And now we work heavily on diabetes and cardiovascular diseases, and that we are part of an NSF ERC, which was awarded in 2017. Then we have a whole big spectrum in the middle where there are clear clinical needs but no technology solution. Mental health is our big focus there. And then what we call the clinical hypothesis space, that it's really, there are hypotheses but there is no way to actually conduct these things because there are no tools and ways to actually answer those questions. And there we have all these, what I call really forward-looking questions on trying to measure loneliness, or how do we make dietary choices? And then in this case, how do we do city-scale resilience testing? And then undercutting all this, which is, these are all behavioral questions, I would call them. Undercutting this, we have a new expeditions which we got last year in computing, which is trying to build what I call the wearable microscope, so we can actually see below the skin. And the aim is, for us, these are the three components we need. We need to understand how do we measure behavior, so we are building what I call biobehavioral sensors. But we want to understand biology at the same time, so we have to learn to measure biology on the go, beyond just the heart rate or heart rate variability. So we are essentially now trying to invent computational imaging microscopes which can see at cellular scale below the skin. We can already go 2 millimeters below the skin. We're trying to go deeper. If we can go around 10 millimeter, around 100 health conditions can be actually tracked with that kind of a capability. Okay. And then, of course, all this generates some very novel data sets. So we are essentially also focusing heavily on data science for health. As I said, we are across the world's biggest med center, so we are really working across just a huge variety of things. And then really, as I probably already guessed, I like to push things personally into commercialization. So we already had 2 commercial startups, and the third one is actually already on its way, along with some licensing agreements in discussions. So just quickly, really what we are trying to do in bioimaging is essentially this what we call see below the skin. So we want to do non-invasive imaging of below the skin, and really it has 2 major parts to it. We are heavily trying to understand biology as a prior. So this is a picture of a camera being able to see below the skin, and what it's seeing is actually blood perfusion. That means you can actually see how much pulsatile blood flow is there below your skin using just a camera from a meter away. And it's just a regular camera. And it's all signal processing at that point. And then also at the same time innovating in the sensor domain, where we are building these what we call flat cameras. They are essentially they are lensless cameras, so we can actually put them as close to skin as possible and then be able to do imaging. And then I won't say much about biobehavioral sensors, but we actually have a whole slew of projects which are soon going to be published, which will talk about how do we do what I call lifestyle measurements and do them through sensors. So since I'm focusing on the platform side of it, we've actually hit a snag here too. We really don't have a scalable way of translating what we do in the lab to our clinical partners. So, I can't hand them things hanging on wires. I can't hand them test software. I have to hand them products essentially, because they have to put it on in a very real scenarios, and especially in the behavior setting, they have to have people carry them throughout the day. Okay, so that's a non-trivial challenge for an academic organizations too. So as our first step to we've actually had to build our own clinical trial platform. So it's what we call HealthSense. And it's driven through experience, around 10 years of working with clinical partners and running many trials. We have built things, realized that's not what we need, and so on and so forth. Now we actually have a whole platform to do it. And it allows us to do mobile health sensing and interventions. It is designed from an endpoint being our clinical researchers. They can actually do visual programming, and they actually do visual programming to make a custom app, which is, for many software computer scientists, would be a straightforward thing, but it is designed with the things they care about. Okay. But at the same time, we can write Lambda functions on AWS and build anything for them, then wrap it up so that the next trial can reproduce exactly what the previous trial did. And then, huge importance, they actually have a deep observability into what each of these participants are doing in a secure form. So really, it looks like any other cloud mobile platform. but designed specifically for running these kind of custom trials. And then it has a cloud component, and then it has both an app component which has two parts. It can do EMAs, or the participant facing things, and then it can do a lot of background sensor tracking. So here is an example of a completely programmable trial which you cannot do, but this is only a few lines of code in this system, which is, I want to understand my dietary behaviors, for example. So the code essentially senses, if I am in a restaurant for around 10 minutes, it will record it and ask me, what did I eat there? Okay, it will ask me which restaurant I am in, and this is very straightforward for all the computer scientists. But now this is only a visual programming loop for our clinical partners who want to understand dietary behaviors. So essentially, this allows us to actually give them tools where they design trials in ways which are just not possible for them. So this is actually operational and quickly growing. We've already completed 4 IRB approved trials, all in mental health in this case. They're all actually quite unique by themselves. For example, the adult depression trial was our test case. Then we have a teenage depression trial where the platform was used to generate 2 different apps, one for the parents of the teen and the other one for the teens themselves. Then they also studied burnout in medical residents, which is actually very common. And then our most recent one is we are actually they're trying to understand what we call in-person social networks. That means networks we form by actually talking to people. And those are very crucial for actually our mental well-being. But there are now tons of trials. This is a platform which now our partners use. And just a whole slew of things going on. So we built it so that other people can use it and then borrow components from one trial and put it in another place. Okay, so that's all I have on the health space. I will stop here and I'm happy to take questions on any part of the talk.
I just speak loud.
Yeah.
So anyway, how do you handle the medical device interoperability issue in your scalable health system?
Could you be more specific on that?
Lots of devices that currently don't have drivers that you need to integrate, that you'd like to do things with. You have to go up and build them one by one. You have a platform that you're using like OpenICE. No,
not yet, yeah. So I think we are staying away from that right now. That's just too big a chunk for us to work on. We just have enough. This is version 2 which I showed. I already have plans for 3, 4, and 5 because we have so many things lined up in this current limited world, which is. But I think that question keeps coming up, but nobody has put it as a showstopper for us. At least none of our partners. Yeah, but it's an important question. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
We have a group here that created an app that should tell you from an image the dietary information.
Right.
So that could be very.
Yeah. So the way I would see it is that that's actually a module for us. So the way the apps are built as only as shells, and then their behavior is controlled by the actual trial. So the trial decides that what the app will do. I mean, it's a very straightforward, model, but it's very powerful in this context. And then the idea is that if, for example, there are beautiful pieces of work done in Mobisys and other communities which have used phones to do interesting things. And so we want to be able to just drop down in the system. If they're willing to share, they can drop down, and then this is a way to propagate. Then other people can run A plus B plus C plus C D trials because almost all conditions are very complex. So you want to monitor many things, not just one thing. So the current app model is they will go out, work with somebody, they will design an app, they will run it and then find out some results with it, and that will be the end of it. So I think that's just a waste of everybody's time to build apps that way. And that's how almost all app trials are run today. And only very well-funded groups will do that because they have to raise quite a bit of money for each software engineer to build a custom app. So there are CS folks who can do really well. They can do these things, but they don't actually, unfortunately, don't go there. So there's this gap of, you can get published in CS world, but the clinical trial folks are hungry for it, but they don't get to see it. Yeah.
Yeah, are you considering including prescription or prescribed medications for those conditions that you're focused on?
So we
Might affect the different.
Yeah, we will leave it actually from the trial itself. So maybe if they want to test something, so we are basically we are building a shell for them to try it. So it may be that they observe that your blood glucose is this, you should do that versus that. Then what intervention is there, whether you take this medication or that? If it's in real-time change, we let the clinical trial folks, our clinical researchers figure that out. But prescription could be part of it.
It's a gap. I just say, having worked in that field, there's a gap there that could use additional feedback and additional data to be able to help with the prescriptions of the various different medications.
I see. Okay. Maybe I didn't understand the question, I think. So maybe I would like to learn more. If something we can easily build, I would definitely love to do that. Yeah.
I have one question.
Yeah.
So, from a computer science perspective, I think one thing under the two things to talk about is that you take what used to run in data center, in hospital, to software that runs close to users, either in base station or on users' body. So it requires us to put more trust into the software. What's the resilience implication of that?
I haven't thought about it. I have to confess that resilience was not part of the way thought process for it. But for I think especially on the health side, there are enough checks and we have to do before we can even actually hand something, right? So IRB is our check, resilience check, essentially you can say that. So because we were deploying a custom software, and then RISE was also is not in medical school, right? It doesn't have even though it has an IRB and everything, they were worried. So we actually ended up doing a fairly thorough security check of the whole software system, done by somebody else at RISE, so RISE engineers, which was actually very good for us because we had to actually write out pretty much everything. And now those are all standard things, authentication mechanisms, who has access to what, things like that. We are definitely, and then whatever AWS provides us as a default options, right? But I wouldn't say we can take a denial of service attack or things like that. We are too small, right? We are only small trials. So if somebody is trying to do denial of service attacks, then I would be very happy because we are really popular. We are not. We only run small trials and, once in a while too. Yeah. But clearly we haven't thought that through right now. Right now I think we have only inventing the model of what I call software-defined trials. And then the software definition is not in our hand. We are actually giving the software definition to the end user, the clinical researcher. And so that's, I think, a major shift in the way all our clinical partners think. Even though they may be very tech-savvy, but they've never programmed. And now we are teaching them to program, actually, but doing visually. And then give them a library which is growing to choose from. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank Ashu.
Yeah.